Welcome back to another episode of I'll Allow It Nevada, your go-to podcast for insightful glimpses into the Nevada judiciary. I'm your host, Seth Easley, representing the Supreme Court of Nevada Administrative Office of the Courts. We have a special episode today. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is a cornerstone of ensuring that our court system is accessible to all individuals, regardless of any physical, mental, or sensory disabilities. Today, we'll be discussing ADA regulations within the context of Nevada's courts. To discuss this important topic, I'm excited to welcome three knowledgeable guests from the AOC. Charles Rahn, Communications Manager, Kimberly Williams, Language Access Program Administrator, and Emily Kuhlman, Chief People Officer. Thanks, everyone, for joining me today. I'm excited to have so many knowledgeable guests today.
Thanks for having us.
So, a question just for the group. What is the American Disabilities Act?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act is federal legislation that was passed to ensure that civil rights for people who experience life in a different way than many folks who are fully abled is substantially meaningful.
Yep, it does that. It prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The purpose of it was, like Chuck said, to ensure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else, whether that be in any sort of a public space, the workspace, commercial facilities, access to government services, and communications.
Okay, so for Emily, what are some ADA considerations in regards to recruitment and the hiring process?
So this is where I really get to put on my HR hat, which is one of my happy places in all the areas that I work within and cover. Considering ADA for compliance when it comes to recruiting and hiring is so important to create an inclusive environment that does not discriminate against any individuals with any sort of disability. Some of the main areas that I try to look at when, we're talking about the ADA and recruiting and hiring is your job descriptions. Clearly defining those essential functions is really important so that individuals are really only looking at tasks that are truly necessary. It helps to ensure that the qualifications are not discriminatory in any manner. Even when you're advertising for those jobs, using inclusive language and accessible formats is really important, and ensuring that those materials are available via, any avenue. In today's world, that's so much of it is electronic and on the web. We have to make sure that that application process is accessible. So offering still, phone or email or print applications to individuals that may come in is important. We don't want to discriminate against anyone. When it comes to the interview process, that's a big one as well, in ensuring that we have accessible locations. So knowing that you're conducting interviews in areas, providing sign language interpreters if they're needed, written materials, or even additional time for those with cognitive disabilities are things that we look at. For those who do testing in their recruiting and hiring processes, you want to ensure the same thing, that those tests are really only focused on the essential functions of the job, and that those tests are administered in a manner that does not discriminate against anyone, which could include different accommodations such as extended time or assistive technologies to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity. Within recruiting and hiring internally for all our employees and our hiring managers, really just communicating openly and effectively with their applicants about the availability of accommodations is a big one. Not everyone is just going to come forward and say, hey, they asked me to come in. I don't know if they have a ramp available. I don't know if they have these things. So ensuring that, our managers are trained to handle those accommodation requests when they come in, and, discussing in our recruitments that we offer accommodations and, are there to assist. Training and onboarding, again, goes along with that, ensuring that those are done in an accessible format, ensuring that new employees with disabilities feel supported and have the tools that they need to succeed. And then really just ensuring that you have a reasonable accommodation process. So whether it's during the interview process, the actual recruiting time frame, or once an offer is being made, ensuring that you have a clear process for requesting and providing reasonable accommodations to those that may need it, and all of that, I know that was a mouthful, but all of that really helps to avoid the legal risks that go along with it. And then it really broadens your talent pool when you're demonstrating the organization's commitment to diversity and being inclusive.
That's excellent. So it ensures everyone has the equal opportunity to join an organization, to fill any particular position.
Absolutely. Limiting any of those barriers that we can.
So what about some ADA considerations for staff in just day-to-day operations?
Absolutely. So ADA considerations just for our staff day-to-day really focus on creating that accessible environment that accommodates employees with disabilities. Some key areas that we tend to focus on are the physical workplace accessibility, so ensuring that work areas, offices, meeting rooms, restrooms, and even your common areas involve adjustments such as ramps, modified restrooms, ensuring that doorways and aisles are wide enough for wheelchair access, and then providing accessible parking spaces and pathways clear of obstacles are one of the things. The reasonable accommodation process that I just touched on a little bit, making sure that it's clear and efficient, and making sure that our supervisors and employees understand that reasonable accommodations are something that are welcome, something that we want to help with. That includes different things such as modifications, ergonomic furniture, specialized software, adjustable desks, flexible work hours. So even time can be an accommodation in certain situations. I've had times when someone needs an extended break for things such as fresh air breaks when, they have situations with fragrance sensitivity or stuff like that. So it can be any number of things that doesn't create an undue burden on the employer. And it's a fluid process with reasonable accommodations. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a dual purpose, communication between the employee, the manager, human resources, or whoever the professional is that is kind of navigating that process with them. So ensuring supervisors are trained and HR staff know how to handle those requests promptly and confidentially as well is a big thing. Communication and information, and I know Chuck will touch a little bit more on that, but ensuring that our internal and external communications are accessible is a big thing, including that we have materials in different formats, whether that be Braille, large print, or audio formats. When it comes to some of those digital communications and websites, their compatibility are big things. Emergency preparedness is another one. So ensuring that for those emergency preparedness plans that you have, that evacuation procedures take into account the different accommodations that we may have so that they are inclusive. Conducting drills that take into those account people that may have disabilities are important as well. You don't always see that. Hey, if we have an emergency, get down the nearest stairwell is a lot of times what you see. Well, what if someone can't? So ensuring that, for our situations, we have the marshals who are available. We build those plans with those and with our safety committees. So acting as that voice to make sure that all of those training and resources take into account those with disabilities as well. Regular training, I can't say that one enough for all employees, just on ADA compliance, the importance of having a workplace that's inclusive, and just training on those unconscious biases that we may have in disability awareness are a big things. I think as a whole, the world is doing a better job of that as we go, because it is. This 1990 seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't. So this is still newer, especially to smaller organizations, to smaller courts, to courthouses that were built 200 years ago. There are things to take into consideration so that we can offer everything that we can. Technology and equipment, which again, I know my counterparts here will talk about more, ensuring that our workplace technology, computers, telephones, and other devices have assistive technologies, and The last one I can think of is performance management. So ensuring that those performance evaluations that we're conducting are fair and don't penalize employees who may need accommodations. That's always a fun one to talk through with new and even long tenured supervisors. We have situations that come up where, hey, we have these hard outlined, metrics and goals, and taking into account reasonable accommodations on how can we ensure employees with disabilities are evaluated on an equal basis, without limiting their ability to get their job done. And all of these considerations really are not only important for compliance with the ADA, but also for creating that supportive environment that really values diversity and inclusion, and that ultimately leads to a more productive and engaged workforce, which I think is something we all want. So it's one of those, hey, this is to all of our benefits when we're, doing these things and doing them well.
So yeah, that's a lot. When you really take the time to dive in, I guess there are a lot more considerations that I would have even guessed, even just from the recruitment and hiring and the staff side. So that's a lot.
Yep. Everyday interactions, there can be some sort of a reasonable accommodation request for almost all of them. And that's a lot when we have so many professionals within the court that are experts in their area. So hopefully we're doing our job to help support them in navigating it, because it's an important one.
Right. So, Chuck, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about ADA compliance on the virtual side. So can we talk a little bit about ADA compliance, like on the website, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So getting your website to a point where it's accessible is not an easy task. And there's very few professional organizations and governments that have really gotten to where they need to be. Which is another important thing, I think, for people to learn. Don't feel alone if you're behind in this particular area. We're all really working to get to where we're providing the kind of services that we need to be. More specifically, to talk about kind of what makes a website accessible, it's going to come down to usability, to make sure that all the information that is present for people despite ability. You should be able to find any information that anyone else could on your website. A big part of that would be text alternatives. So our websites these days are full of rich media, images, forms, places where you can type in information. And it's making sure that those are designed in a way that can be accessed with adaptive technologies, could be accessed even without adaptive technologies by somebody who may have a disability or an impairment. So that can mean even making sure that text can be resized without losing its ability to be read, so that people whose eyesight is not excellent could be able to adapt it in that way. A big one is going to be keyboard accessibility. We're making sure that all functions of a website work even without a mouse. So the interesting thing about a mouse is that is a feedback loop between generally somebody with vision, and not everybody has that capability.
Right.
So making sure that all of your menus, the content in your website can all be accessed with just the keyboard or just some sort of human interface device that does not require a visual feedback loop. So another one is going to be consistent navigation. When you're on a website, the navigation should not change from place to place. Ideally, the same function should be accessible in the same way, no matter where you are. And if that's changing, it's going to be extremely difficult for somebody who is learning to navigate it using patterns and previously learned experiences. So we want to make sure that those things are always consistent. Another one is going to be contrast ratio. If you have a lot of light gray text on a white background, that's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to see. This was actually a really old trick that people used to use to kind of get around making legal disclosures and stuff on websites, was to have extremely low contrast ratio on required text. Yeah. but that absolutely is an unacceptable practice. Should not be a surprise. Another one is really going to be labeling. When content is placed on a website, oftentimes it's just sat there and we assume that the user will see this content and will understand what it is based on the context, but that is not going to be true for everyone. So an important thing is making sure that things like form fields are labeled to explain what they are, making sure that they are clear and they provide instructions on exactly how to do it, and ensuring that they do work with assistive technologies. Another one is going to be to implement what we call accessible rich internet application landmarks, or ARIA features, which just kind of help point out where things on a website are or what they do. They just provide a lot more context to a user as they are browsing the website with adaptive technologies. That's some of the overview of it. I would say that making an accessible website is not always very easy. It's going to be something that takes constant work and constant iteration. I like to say that accessible practices are kind of like growing a lawn. You have to maintain it constantly and you have to be always improving it and working on it. It's not something that you just get done.
It's an ongoing process.
Always.
Okay. So what about forms and documents that can be found on a website? What can be done to make those ADA compliant?
So forms and documents are going to face many of the same issues that you do see on a website. So some of those really important things that you want to make sure that you are doing when you're designing informational products is going to be making sure that formats are put together well. Information put in tables can be extremely difficult for some adaptability technologies to interpret, and they can be very difficult to actually use other technologies to make them work. So I do generally recommend avoid putting information in tables. That's a really big one. Another one is going to be ensuring that every time an image is present, that there is alternative text that describes precisely what's in the image. And that needs to happen for even images that include text. So your alternative labels need to include any text that's in the image. And then you need to be writing descriptions of it. And my pro tip for that is when you're trying to decide what goes in an alt tag for an image, start just foreground, middle ground, background. And it just gives you 3 quick questions that you can answer, and they will create a pretty high quality descriptor of that image. Some of the other things that are going to be really big in documents, and this is really tricky in PDF documents, is what we call heading nesting or heading order. And that is ensuring that the big text at the top of a document is labeled as, hey, this is the big important thing. And that other headings as you're going through text are consistently labeled. So every time something is the second layer of heading, it kind of has a similar meaning as how that so in a visual representation, you would have a big headline and then a subheadline and maybe some other subheadlines. So it's making sure that those are labeled inside of a document in a consistent way and that they are done completely sequentially. This is very difficult to describe auditorially, but the idea is that you're creating consistent structures of your text information, right, and that can be communicated to somebody who can't physically see that the text is a little bit bigger and bolder there. And there are tools built into Adobe to really help you rectify that situation if you haven't, or just to get it right in the first place, or just to check. Those are some really common ones that we see. Another one is just making sure that metadata for documents is correct. Oftentimes you think we have this file has a label or it has a file name and that describes what it is, but that's not the same thing as actually a title for a document. And that's an important aspect of how the information can be construed to somebody using adaptive technologies. I would generally say that remediating documents to become compliant with ADA, so we typically use a standard called WCAG, which is this Web Content Accessibility Group. And WCAG standards are the best way to make progress towards meeting ADA compliance issues. And there's a lot of automated tools out there to help you figure out where you need to go and how to get there. In addition to that, there's a lot of training available through the state of Nevada, and we're developing some training of our own that we're hoping to have available later this fall.
Excellent. So before we kind of move away from this, you touched a little bit already on media, such as photos. Do you have anything to add about other forms of media, be it video, audio?
Yes, absolutely. So media in general is an extremely important part to get right for accessibility issues. So we already talked about alternative tags for images, which just provide a written description of what's in an image. Another important thing is going to be captions and transcripts. So a video that doesn't have captions or transcripts is really not going to be meeting standards and probably should not be included on government websites or anybody who's particularly interested in making sure that they're complying with the ADA. So that's a really critical thing. We like to make sure before we post a video anywhere on our website, we have double checked that it does in fact have closed captioning available. If not, we can work on getting it added in. These days, there's a ton of really great AI tools. There's also features built into YouTube that can help you out with the video. And those transcripts are fantastic because they can allow people with adaptive technologies to even follow along with media, be it through Braille devices, through screen readers, all kinds of ways. And we're just making sure that we're not hiding that from people with different abilities. Another one is going to be audio descriptions for video content. So if something that you're offering media-wise is completely visual and we've just assumed the user can look at the context and figure out what's going on, consider doing audio description for it as well. Kind of think of it as the same way you would adapt a television news story for the podcast, right? You would have to describe what's going on in the video. That's a really important one. Another one is making sure that your media players are accessible. And this is maybe a little bit on the techie side, but making sure that any applications that you're using to enhance the interface between the media and the users, a lot of really old school ones were built before accessibility concerns were front and center like they are now. So they are a huge deal. And another, getting back to just making sure that we have sufficient contrast in things, ensuring that you're not using color as the sole means of communicating information. Okay. So if you were to say, hey, look at this chart, everything in green represents XX. Well, that's fantastic if you happen to be somebody who can see the color green. And that's something we have to keep in mind in kind of all of our graphical communications, coming down to our social media content, reports we're publishing, information shared with commissions and committees. I mean, it goes everywhere, and it's one of the really tricky ones to get right because we've all developed habits to kind of communicate that way otherwise.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of I'll Allow It Nevada. We are always striving to bring you valuable insights and education, not just for judicial officers, but for anyone interested in the Nevada judiciary. If you find our content helpful or intriguing, please share your experience with your friends, family, and colleagues. Your support helps us reach a broader audience and ensures that more people can benefit from our discussions. Thank you for listening and supporting I'll Allow It Nevada. Okay, so Kim, what are some ADA considerations regarding physical accommodations?
So Emily touched on a lot of it, like the building accessibility and the ramps, elevators for people that can't move around very easily. Other things are the doors, that they're easy to open. They're not too heavy. Signage that has good contrast, like black and white, so it's easily read. Braille on all kinds of forms, signs, like in the elevator, for example, so they can know what room they're going to or level they're going to. Sitting options in all public spaces, counters and desks at a height that's low enough to accommodate wheelchair users, service animals, accessibility to emergency exits, which includes audible and visual alarms for hearing and visual impairments.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about language accessibility. So Kim, can you tell us about language accessibility for limited English proficiency people?
I like to provide a story. asking you to imagine you're this person.
Okay.
It's a soldier was deployed to Turkey, and one afternoon he went out smoking and was tossing pebbles at a trash can, which is a harmless activity. A cat suddenly jumped out of the cans, and the soldier accidentally hit it. The officer witnessed the incident and immediately arrested him. The soldier, who only knew a few words in Turkish, was brought before a judge and unintentionally pled guilty to purposely harming the cat. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Fortunately, a military interpreter was later provided, and the judgment was overturned once the established incident was determined as accidental. This situation could have been avoided if a proper language proficiency assessment had been made. The interpreter had been provided on the first hearing, and that the charges would have been translated for the soldier's native language. On the other side, cultural training would have been beneficial for the soldier had he been provided information knowing that cats are sacred in Turkey and would have understood more of what was going on. Other language accessibility options are including like I Speak cards, employing bilingual staff that can assist outside of the courtroom, asking the individual about their language preferences, also using visual aids and graphics could help bridge the language gap. This ensures effective communication support. And just a little plug, if you can't find a qualified interpreter, please reach out to court interpreters at nvcourts.nv.gov, and we'll do our best to help you find somebody.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, language accessibility is a very important thing, especially within our courts. So Kim, can you give us a quick overview of accommodation requests? What are they, and how can someone make a request, and how do we fulfill them?
Accommodation requests are formal requests that's made by the individual that needs an adjustment or modifications to perform the duties or access the services that are due to disabilities that they're dealing with. It's ensured to provide equal opportunity and access to all people. One of the suggestions on how to make an accommodation request is you can do it through a request form. You can do a formal letter and email. In some cases, you can even call in and do it verbally. You need to identify the need, determine what specific adjustments are needed to perform the tasks or access the services. And you need to include relevant information, like describe the need, provide medical documentation if applicable, and your preferred result, how you want the accommodation to be provided. And I recommend contacting the appropriate person or department. It's dependent on the situation. It could be human resources, it can be an ADA coordinator, or even customer services, how you would start it.
You just reminded me of something important when it comes to employees making requests or even those prior. They only have to make it once. It doesn't have to be like, hey, I'm sharing my medical information with you and I need this. And sometimes that's what those who receive the request expect. I'm sure you've experienced that as well, Kim, in some fashion or another with individuals. They don't have to share their medical information with, those outside of the ADA coordinator, whoever, if they're asking for that, medical documentation or paperwork. Sometimes it can just come in the form of a request like, hey, do you have this, printed in larger font? And that's where that training piece is so important in, you don't want someone to respond with, well, why do you need that? So I'm glad you touched on that, Kim. Thank you.
No problem. A couple other samples was I recently provided somebody with a large Sharpie and a large pad of paper just to be able to do his test. And traditionally we do it with just a small pencil and a small piece of paper for them to write their notes on. Another person was needing a medical accommodation. And I don't know what the situation is specifically because all I took was a letter from her doctor telling me what she needed. And we were able to use that information and provide them the accommodation.
And this is, and that's regarding accommodations specifically for your court interpreter program certification tests?
Good point, yes.
Okay.
So a couple ways to fulfill these requests. You need to look over it, see if it's valid, if it's feasible, consider if it's reasonable, and if it doesn't cause any undue hardship. You also need to implement the accommodation, obviously. Provide whatever adjustments made. This could be modifying physical environments, adjusting work schedules, providing assistive technologies like cart captioning, or offering additional support services. You need to clearly communicate with the implementations of the services you're going to provide to the person and be responsive to any further needs or issues that may arise with what you provide. And documentation. I can't tell you how much it's beaten to me, but documentation, document all your records, keep all your accommodation requests and steps taken to fulfill it. And anything that was related to the process, it helps maintain compliance and provides a reference for future needs.
I have another piece to pipe in here with, because Kim is just making my brain work today. Something else to consider with both of those is not all disabilities are permanent. There can be temporary disabilities as well. Pregnancy can, be considered a temporary disability depending on, what's happening and what's going on. So it's not always, again, just a hard and fast, you either have a disability or you don't. That's where that, fluid accommodations and open conversations come into play as well.
And the AOC even does a pretty good, so they have I don't remember the name of it. It's a good program for new mothers. That's considered an accommodation.
Yep. So there's a handful of different, things that are offered to new parents. One of the things that we do within the AOC is our infinite work, not infinite like forever, but the Infant at Work program. So mothers or fathers can bring their child who is less than 1 year old or not yet mobile to the office for the first, again, until one or the other happens. And then, hey, it could get a little bit much or a little bit dangerous, but they're able to bring them to the office, which is great for that bonding period that they have. And, a benefit, we've seen it increase some, have some culture benefits as well. People tend to like it, but it does seem to help out.
So a couple just broader questions for the group. How can one determine if they are complying with accessibility requirements?
That's the difficult one. Mm-hmm. That's a really difficult one. I would say my number one advice for that is ask for help from experts. I could sit here and tell you things that make a document or a website compatible or compliant today. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, and there's going to be little things that you learn along the way. This is not something where there is a set in stone achievement, like, hey, you've done it, you made it, you're there. That will never happen. And I also would say that these things don't generally happen on accident, and they require a lot of thoughtful planning and work and review. So that would be my number one thing is you can absolutely use some technologies that help you figure things out, but reach out to people who can help you. Reach out to people who are considering these same things on a day-by-day basis.
Right. So does anyone have any advice you would give to judges or court personnel who are seeking to better serve individuals with disabilities?
Put yourself in their shoes. What would you like available to you if you were facing the same situation? And ask if you're insured. It's what we're here for.
Yeah, and I think, again, from us, a lot of it's the access to justice piece, which is important and one of our drivers, and, find the best ways possible to provide access to justice to everyone, those that are like us, those that are not like us, any and all fashions.
And I think it also goes back to, like Emily was talking about, in just day-to-day operations with your staff, but just learning to listen for those things that could end up being an accommodation, but maybe it's not super apparent right away. Just, if somebody says, do you have this in a larger print? Let that trigger your thought process. And that's just a skill that you have to build over time.
It sounds like training might be good.
Yep, training until it's the normal and the everyday, and we don't have to think about it.
Right. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. Does anyone have any final thoughts, anything that they want to share on ADA compliance?
I'm just appreciative of my peers over here. I know that our website takes a lot of work, but I have a better idea, even after participating in this, how much work Charles and his team are doing over there, and Kim as well.
Yeah, I've learned a lot today too. Yeah, that's what's fun about the podcast. All right, well, thanks for joining me. This was a great episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A heartfelt appreciation to our guests and to everyone who has tuned into this podcast. Before we wrap up, here are a couple of important reminders. For continuing legal education credit, be sure to complete a certificate of attendance and email it to jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. If you have any questions, topic suggestions, or comments, we welcome your input. Please email them to jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. We value and look forward to hearing from our listeners. Stay tuned for more episodes of I'll Allow It Nevada, released bi-monthly. This is Seth Easley signing off. Take care, Nevada.